Hello, everybody. This is Craig Watson from the Pacific War Channel, where we cover the entire history of the Asia-Pacific War from 1937 to 1945, and all the major events that led up to it. I'm joined here yet again by a new face. Gaurav, how are you?
Hey, Greg, glad to be back. Really looking forward to today's discussion.
Glad to see you. And again, just like the last time, this is a similar episode. So the last time we did the underrated moments of the Pacific War, and you were really keen to talk about some underrated moments of World War II in Europe, we'll call it, I guess. And I had you come up with some ideas. You had probably more than 10. We've nailed it down to 3 ideas, and even those are way too large for the podcast. So we're going to try to tackle these 3 issues in 15 to 20 minutes each. We'll see. And it's going to be the first one. You wanted to do logistics, which should be its own podcast series of its own. But we're going to try and narrow that down to the North African campaign because I think it's a good case study.
Yeah,
Yeah,
completely. I think that's what many logistics personnel will probably be studying today, I guess.
absolutely. The second one is going to be Operation Shingle. And then the
Yeah.
third one will be the landings in southern France, part of Operation Dragoon. Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you know I now have a Patreon account found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there you can find exclusive Patreon episodes and podcasts based on suggestions from patrons, and other benefits like early access to all of my content, live hangouts, your name in the end credits, and much, much more. So please go check it out. But
Yeah.
yeah, stating all of that, just like you said, when it comes to the North African campaign, of all the literature I've ever read, Pacific War, World War II, it's the only time you actually see logistics at the forefront. Every single author, they can't talk about North Africa without the logistical issues because it's what won or lost the campaign.
That's completely true. And not to mention because there are such few ports in North Africa compared to, like, say, Northern Europe, right? You would have the great ports of France, Antwerp, and also it's kind of easy for the Northern allies, like the allies in Northern France, to get their supplies. But for example, the main port for the Axis forces was Tripoli, which at its peak was not really able to handle like all the monthly supplies that Rommel and the Italian armies needed. And that was a big nightmare. That's why they had to make that drive to Alexandria as quick as possible to get another port.
Yeah, Tripoli and even Benghazi, both of them were small, but
Yeah.
crucially underdeveloped. So the Italians who had control of these, I mean, not for a lack of time, mind you, they had the time. They didn't develop them to take on the necessary amount of shipping, and then everything you can imagine for facilities, service crews, everything to get things from the port onto trucks to go out was lacking. And then this is not only for the Italians, but in North Africa in general, they didn't have any significant railways. So there
Y-
was 2 major railways on both sides that were like less than 30 kilometers a track or something. And they served no real military purpose because they weren't useful because of the nature of where they were fighting in North Africa.
Yeah, and also I think one other big challenge that these guys had to face, right, in the logistics is also the lack of metal roads.
Yes.
It really slowed down so many convoys, pursuits, retreats, whatever, just because these guys did not have a good road. So that allows your enemy to catch up or whatever, depending on which side you are. And I was just seeing some interesting information about Libya, right? So, at one point, it actually was that when Rommel landed, the Axis forces were getting around a little over 72,000 tons of supplies a month,
Yeah.
which is slightly more than what was their estimated requirement of around 70,000. But here's the catch. They needed about 24,000 tons worth in fuel, but half of that is just consumed taking the fuel to the front.
Yeah, so just to explain to the audience, because this is something that's lost on people. If you were to pull up a map in North Africa right now and just forget about all the numerous cities, look at the coast that touches the north part and imagine that's a large highway that goes all the way across. It's not really, but it had to be in that way. And if you're looking at your starting point at Tripoli, you're going from Tripoli to Benghazi, and then to Tobruk. Tobruk is going to change hands multiple times between Axis and Allies, but
Yeah,
Tobruk does become a supply depot. And then we'll call like the front lines El Alamein. For the most
yeah,
part, that area saw a lot of the action. And if you're going from Tripoli all the way over to there, it's about 1,400 or so miles. And if you're landing the majority at Tripoli, and the majority was going to Tripoli,
yeah,
about 50% of that fuel will be used by the trucks moving that fuel to El Alamein. So you're losing
yeah.
50% of the fuel and also the water. So the water is being used by people and even for vehicles as well, going along that path. And because this is one of the worst climates for vehicles, and the Axis did not have good, the Allies did better with their trucks, but the Axis, their trucks were not built for desert conditions. A lot of them broke down from heat, wear and tear, the dust that got into stuff. You were losing so much. So it was one of the worst fuel attrition wars you could ever imagine.
Yeah, and actually, like speaking about the trucks, I think it was said the main thing also is they did not even have enough trucks to even just
Yeah.
get all the supplies, right? Not only do they need fuel, they need ammo. Because I remember at one point, just before the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Axis forces artillery officers, they were told, like, guys, don't fire too much. We don't have that much ammo. Make every shot count. Like,
Yeah.
and I'm listening to a book by James Holland, which is talking about the war in the
Uh-huh.
West. So I'm right on the second volume. So some of the diary extracts, it's talking about like, the Italian soldiers, like the rations were also quite poor. So, these
Yes.
guys are sapped for fighting strength because they're not getting enough food. Water, as you said, is also an issue. So even though they had even fewer vehicles, at any given point, because as you said about that 14,000 mile, 1,400 mile distance, depending on where the front line was, at any given point of time, 35% of all Axis supplied trucks were under repair. And this was like a big problem with the Axis. They had so many models of cars, trucks, Jeeps, everything.
Yeah.
They did not have the spares because no one had the scale to give it out. Because, you let manufacturer A make two trucks, manufacturer B make three. So, that economies of scale doesn't play in.
Yeah,
So this,
it goes into an even broader subject. Germany had some of the most fantastic tanks of World War II. They were meticulously crafted. These were not Ford assembly line like by any means. The American model was, the Ford model, whereas the Germans, you could have literal one guy see start to finish on a single tank. It wasn't full-time war economy at all. And because of that, the parts were rather extravagant. The parts were different for just even in the Germans, like they had different parts for all of their tanks. Nothing was universal. Whereas the Americans, they made universal parts. They made it so that transporting the parts to just a tank would be actually an easy thing. Whereas I think if I remember correctly, to repair most of the Panzer tanks, it required like three different trucks to bring three different things to just repair one. So it was all over the place. And as for the
yeah,
Italians, like the Italians and the
the
Germans were not working together on their models. The Italian tanks, well, if you want to call them tanks, were, you know,
armored cars probably.
yeah,
Yeah. No, but speaking of that, because in his series, right, James Holland does highlight this, because it is like I think the Nazi Party regime of really wanting to show a grandiose kind of thing,
yeah,
whether it was for their artillery, their uniforms, their tanks, their aircraft, but that made it so much more difficult to engineer. And they let like the corporations also have a big say, and
yes,
those
they
guys were
did.
focused on designing more and more, whereas some of like the Wehrmacht generals wanted like, guys, we need to simplify, we are not getting enough. And
Yeah,
this is like where the British and American manufacturing power, and I will also say wartime common sense also kicked in.
yeah. I had
Because
a one of my friends actually brought up once. You would never think about this, but the paint used for American tanks is your standard army green, and it was a
yeah,
universal paint. It was on everything. For the German Panzers, they had these extravagant camos, and the corporations that were pumping out the tanks, they refused to let the tanks go out without this elaborate paint job that took much longer. And they
yeah,
simply could have just, the same color as the Stahlhelm, whatever you want. They could have done that, but they often
yeah.
didn't. Yeah.
I mean, it just kind of puts a stark contrast as like, like in Stalingrad, like you literally had like unpainted half-finished T-34s just rolling off to support the defense of the city,
Yeah,
and then you have this. But that does put to your point, right? Like there are no spares, and if you cannot put spares, your vehicles are not going to be recoverable. I think the British and Americans in North Africa were able to recover more than two-thirds of their vehicles, right? Like
it was
they get
incredible.
knocked down they get knocked
And yeah,
down and maybe the crews die, but ultimately, barring like the aircraft or the tank or the truck being a total wreck, most of the time they would just send a unit, get it back, and it'll get patched up properly because it's not difficult.
yeah, and the Americans made sure when they were providing, let's say, the M3, the Stuarts that were coming out there, they were comparable to some British models, just so that there was overlap if there was like parts that could be used for either or. I'm not sure if it was the Matilda or something, but one of them had comparable parts. So the repair,
Might be
even
the
if
Matilda or the Crusader, because I
Crusader,
know they were
yeah,
the
yeah, it might be the
two
Crusader,
tanks.
and the service crews, because you need people who are engineers or repairmen to make to maintain these things. They were training together, they were doing things, whereas in general the Axis did not work together at all. It's
E-
incredible, like the miscommunications between them, whereas if you look at just the Americans and the British, incredible teamwork. I mean, the British gave away a lot of secrets and stuff to the
Yeah.
Americans, as well, except for Ultra, mind you, but I mean, they kept that one close to the heart, and I understand why.
And at the same time, even like they had a far better working relationship with the Soviet Union compared to like the Axis powers. And it does come to the fact that both Hitler and Mussolini had completely different objectives on how this thing should proceed.
Yes.
And also one more thing is they was not at all grounded in reality in how they were seeing the situation play out. So
Yeah.
unfortunately, that led to such catastrophic decisions in terms of, and that also played directly into the logistics hand, you know?
I just realized this is a conversation about logistics. One thing that the audience needs to be made aware is the choice for there to be a North African campaign was a logistical issue. So
Yeah.
the British, not that they were solely dependent on oil from Iraq or Iran, although of course it helps. The Americans were providing oil when the Americans joined the war. But until the Americans really got into the war, because even when they entered, they were for a year not really there, let's say.
Yeah.
But the British, they had to protect the Suez Canal because this was the lifeblood. It was their line of communications. They're not going to get any Anzac troops or troops from India if it's if it's closed down.
And
I
the
mean,
supplies.
the supplies and the oil was crucial, and to deny the Germans the oil. So for the North African campaign, the British had put a high priority on defending Egypt and the surrounding area. But for the Axis, the soft underbelly of Europe was also an entry point into Romania. So the
Yeah.
Germans were, and even the Italians, were depending on the Romanian oil fields. And Hitler knew if Italy was knocked out of the war, this would threaten the entire southern portion of Europe, and then his oil could get cut off, which he already had little of. And
Yeah.
in his own words, he had told his generals, if Tripoli fell, he believed the Italians would be out of the war. So he had put a directive, and then he sent Rommel.
Yeah.
Well,
And
Rommel
actually,
ended up going.
one more thing about the British in, Africa. Right. That was also one of the first places they felt they could start testing their new troops after Dunkirk against Axis ground forces.
Yes.
And I think, as you said, while the British were not completely dependent on the oil fields because they were buying oil from Venezuela, US, because in the 1940s, the US was the largest producer.
Yep. Of
They actually used the Persian oil fields to just actually fuel their armies locally within North Africa.
course.
So that was actually quite smart because it led them the supply line. Because one of my uncles, he's like he was in the Indian Air Force. Like he told me like this concept, right, which most military personnel will know. It's the teeth to tail ratio. So the longer the tail line, the slower you'll fight.
Yeah.
So I think this is like and I think this is one of the biggest drawbacks of Rommel as a general. He did not believe in logistics. He did not understand it because quite often the reason his superiors, both the German and the Italians, were telling him, "Guy, just hold on," is because they knew they needed to build up their supplies so that they can maintain an offensive. Now,
Yeah.
I also understand, from Rommel's point of view, he wanted to probably keep the initiative, But once you overstretched yourself so much, and you did mention like Tobruk, right? Because it had a port, it was a good defensive location because, the first siege, I think the Australian units held out for, I think, like 9 months or something
Yeah, it was incredible.
against the Axis. Yeah. So one thing is, even though we talked about Tripoli able to handle like, a good chunk of the Axis supplies, Tobruk actually was not even going to alleviate quite a bit
No, because the
because
RAF could just rain hell upon it every day.
true, but its capacity, right? As you said, alluding to the fact of the underdevelopment of the region,
Yeah,
the port could handle like about 15 to 1600 tons of supplies a
which
month.
is a
So
joke. It's not
yeah, I
significant.
mean, I mean, if the army needs 70,000, this is not really, putting a dent. And as you
Yeah.
said, the RAF in the Desert Air, Western Desert Air Force, like I think under their air marshal, I think nickname Mary, I think I'm kind of forgetting his name right now. Um,
Yeah, I don't remember either.
Arthur. Yeah, but what
Arthur,
I really
yeah,
appreciate, Air Marshal Arthur, right? He led the Western Desert Air Force so well because he, for quite a while, actually like forbade the RAF from engaging the Messerschmitts. No
which
aerial combat, but
and
he
that
was
that's
targeting
the proof of concept that for example, if you're talking about one of the issues in the Pacific War for the Japanese for their naval aviators was they were always glory hunting instead of
yeah,
focusing on specific targets. So let's say heavy bombers were the biggest threat to some kind of location, and instead of focusing only on them, if they saw something else, they would go after it. What you're saying over
yeah,
here is true. The Italian air forces in North Africa were such a lucrative target because they were flying a lot of outdated aircraft that were easy
yeah,
pickings, but he maintained and kept his pilots in line so that they actually went after what was strategically important. And it's going to be
yeah,
convoys and any aircraft trying to bring over fuel from well later on, because
yeah,
we'll get into it, but when the Axis starts getting pinched and their convoys aren't making it, they do this last ditch effort, and this is during the Second Battle of El Alamein, where they're flying
yeah,
fuel over, and it's
yeah.
really this is a desperate act.
And again, the same problem that we highlighted, half of the fuel that the guy is carrying is,
Yep,
consumed by the same aircraft to take it back.
exactly.
And what I was reading is, the pilot of the Luftwaffe who, was one of the pilots engaged on this mission, right? He said when he would land with the other aircraft, they did not have any bomb bays, like bombs or anything. They were
Yep.
just filled with fuel. Like Panzers would just be rolling up to the side of the aircraft and just directly refueling. I mean, just
Yeah.
it's crazy when you think about it, but that is the desperation. And I think one part of the Mediterranean and North Africa that we need to do, like, talk about for a bit is Malta.
Yeah.
The importance of that island cannot be understated.
And it's weird to say to the audience here because they probably aren't aware of this, because I believe for Kings and Generals, the North African campaign series is exclusive to the Patreon for now, I believe.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know
it's
what
correct.
will happen. I assume they'll put it out to the general public as like a big documentary, or I don't know. They haven't told me. But I'm currently writing this series, and the nature of it doesn't allow me to cover so much of what we would call the excess. So even if I'm talking
Yeah,
about logistical stuff, I'm almost doing like finger notes for the animators, and they're gonna write stuff on the screen. I can't really talk about too much because I'm covering too much information in a short amount of time, and
the,
I
I
barely
know.
talk about Malta. Yeah,
I know, but that was the one of the biggest
yeah.
thorns in the Axis logistics because, and the British recognized that.
Very soon, yeah.
Eh, yeah, and like you had a submarine flotilla based there, you had Spitfire squadrons based there. I think the only time it really got desperate was, I think, in the first half of 1942 when Albert Kesselring took command in the region of Luftflotten 2 and started to bombard the hell out of Malta. And that time the British were also kind of in a funk with their command in that entire theater of operations.
They juggled a few commanders, but it all overly simplify Malta. The Operation Heracles, you want to say it properly, Operation Heracles, which was supposed to be the invasion of Malta to finally neutralize and take
Yeah.
it, but the idea was to neutralize it through bombing campaigns between the Italians and the Germans, and they simply couldn't. they bombed the hell out of it. It's incredible, but they could not neutralize it enough. And they got cold feet when it came time to actually perform an invasion. And Rommel was, of course, aware of all this. Rommel wanted to take charge of the invasion. Actually, he was willing to
Actually,
take
no. I
frontline troops.
actually he did not want the invasion of Malta. He wanted the priority of the resources and men to
Yeah.
come to him in North Africa.
Well,
Kesselring was
yeah.
the guy who was, and the Italians were big advocates for the invasion.
I mean,
And
he had no
as you
choice in the
said,
matter, though. Like it was happening.
yeah,
So when he was told it was happening, he said, "Can I just lead it? Then I'll take the frontline troops." Like he was, I think, at El Alamein, not the El Alm Halfa, or I don't know if it was around the first battle of El Alamein, and he literally he just said to the commanders, "I'll take some frontline troops if we can do this quickly," because he realized how he had basically
yeah,
completely screwed himself. He was stuck 1,400 miles away from his main port of supply, and he was just watching as the British were receiving supplies, and he was told they were going to receive this famous convoy of like 100,000 tons, and
that
he
was I think
just
the 300 Sherman tanks from Roosevelt.
and he in his head he said, I have to win this before that is there or I'm done. And
Exactly.
yeah. And the Heracles
Yeah,
operation he was told was supposed to happen, I think just before the first battle of El Alamein, or it was around that time, or it was between the first and second battle. And because that failed, it doomed him completely.
yeah, and I think you know, the problem is the Germans did not capitalize, as you said, because Kesselring did batter Malta quite badly. They were desperate. Like I think at one point they were not having fuel for the Spitfires and submarines. That the entire submarine flotilla had relocated to Alexandria
Yeah.
so that they could still continue to operate. And I think the biggest saving grace was the launch of Operation Pedestal, the most heavily guarded convoy. And even though it took brutal losses, just enough made it
Yeah.
that more, I mean, I don't think there's ever been a more fortified convoy in history. But it
Probably
kept
not,
Malta in
no.
the fight.
I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean,
yeah.
which air convoy will tell you that it had four aircraft carriers, two battleships, seven cruisers, 32 destroyers allocated.
It People forget about just in general when they think World War II, a lot of people don't even consider the Mediterranean Sea theater. And
Yeah,
it was such a slugging match for like about 2 solid years. And I mean, the U-boats alone were still doing so much damage to that. And then you have, the Italian Navy, mind you, that I mean, the Italian Navy got such a bloody nose with Taranto on the first
yeah,
raid in 1940. They came out and they gave another bloody nose to the British, but the British retained supremacy in the Mediterranean for the
yeah,
vast majority of the time, and that's what really was the crux of it. The Not that it was completely safe for Allied convoys to be moving in there, but
yeah,
compared to the Axis, it was night and
yeah,
day. The Axis, they had to expect to lose significant amounts of any transport ships that would be moving, and that's why they
yeah.
chose the routes that were the safest, so to Tripoli. Because if they even tried to risk when they went to Benghazi, if they sent anything to Benghazi, it was certainly going to be attacked by
Yeah, and I think, like I said, after Pedestal and in the second half of 42, when, competent commanders are put in, Keith Park was made air commander at Malta, like he left Fighter Group 10
yeah,
in the Battle of Britain. And, Harold Alexander took over the Eighth Army and CNC in Africa. Things started to really pick up. And
yeah,
I think what also hampered the problems for the logistics again for the Axis was because these guys are now attacking from Malta, which is now reinforced and able to stand its ground against the Luftwaffe. Then you had the British Navy in Alexandria also running. You know, the big ships, right? The big transport ships, the big cargo ships are most of them on every voyage are getting sunk. That I think towards just before the battle, second battle of El Alamein, the Axis were relying on these smaller transport and smaller craft,
yeah.
which are not going to be efficient. They, I think they'll carry like what 1/10 the supplies at the best and take almost twice as long because it's just not efficient. So, this is like, where like logistics is so key and underrated for war. And still maintain it deserves its due credit, which sadly doesn't get.
If people are actually interested in the subject, you don't even have to pay for it. You can go on Google right now, and there's some U.S. military edition manuals that actually cover. It'll be called There's one booklet. It's called "The Logistics of World War II." It covers almost A to Z. It's a little old, mind you, but it always it's interesting to look through it to just see, especially at the time, what they were the most concerned about and what they were looking at. And I mean, what was it? Someone simplified it as the American production at home. It has to first be produced, then it's going to be put onto a train that's going to go to a port. From the port, it's going to go onto a ship. And if we're talking about the Pacific, it's going thousands of miles to God knows some island. And it's
Yeah.
fascinating to see the entire system and the production. And the United States had to come up with a whole new organization for the war on how their service teams are going to do everything. And if you look at this and then you look at what Germany did, not the same, not the same at
That
all.
yeah, I mean, to me, it's just like, like the elite units of a game versus like, when you just start off with that game, it's
Yep.
literally feels like that to me, the way they were organized. But,
And
that's
yeah,
that's the thing of logistics, right?
and it's going to kill people. Because I know we're not going to be able to cover the other two subjects if we don't. But
Yeah,
let's move on to Operation Shingle, which you know what? I didn't know
yeah,
that much about this until you had brought it up and I did my research. I was not aware of what an absolute nightmare and major mistakes were made in this one. This is an incredible story. I don't know if you want to
yeah.
take point and explain to everybody.
Sure.
Well, the maybe we should start. This is going to be involving the Italian campaign. So chronologically, we're going from North Africa, which does evolve into Operation Husky.
Italy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Sicily and then Italy. And
yeah.
explain to the audience.
So, I think, as everyone knows, like, after North Africa was secured, the Italian campaign started because, as Churchill coined it, it is the soft underbelly that he wanted to make a drive towards,
Yep.
which, I should point out the American generals did not even believe was the soft underbelly. And after they took over Sicily, then, they land on the boot of Italy and start advancing up the country. You had like I think a British army towards the Adriatic coast and the US army. You had two armies, right? And the US was on the western coast of Italy. But the problem was Italy is very mountainous and once they reach
Oh
towards the
yeah.
center. And Albert Kesselring, who was in supreme command of the theater, he made good use of that terrain that he bought towards the end of 1943. Despite overwhelming material and manpower advantages, the British and Americans had been bogged down to a halt. So that's when, the idea kind of came is a lot from Winston Churchill of,
Yes.
landing behind the lines, which could be a breakout.
Oh,
And
and
the
just for the
idea was,
audience, so the lines that he's talking about, famously, there's a few lines, but the Gustav
yeah,
line,
Gustav lines. So I'm
which
sorry,
was
Harsh.
basically, we're talking about a defensive line that was so formidable, it would delay the Allies about a year.
Yeah, yeah. So the concept of this idea was, you land a sizable force behind and the Gustav line on the western Italian coast and either threaten Rome or start outflanking and attacking the enemy from the rear. That, it would ultimately force them to withdraw because if one part of your line withdraws, then, you'll have to withdraw the entire lines
Exactly.
because the other you are not going to sacrifice so many men. So that is where the idea came in. I think, some people have said this is kind of like Churchill trying to romanticize what he tried with the Gallipoli campaign in World War I.
Yeah, it's
And
always compared to
he
Gallipoli. Yeah.
yeah, and he was also like, the biggest supporter for this operation, even though like, Eisenhower at that time wanted to withdraw the landing craft and men to England in preparation for Overlord.
Yeah,
But,
no, this
Church,
did definitely set back a lot of things. It was simply just the LSTs for the landing crafts that had to be used for
yeah,
this operation. It really, it's funny. We're going to be talking about the southern landings in France. The Shingle directly
yeah,
influences that because of
exactly.
resources. Yeah,
Yeah, and so the thing is, Churchill does, manage to get the LSTs, and the American General Mark Clark is put in overall command of the operation. and he selects his General Lucas to be John P. Lucas to lead the initial landing
To
force.
sacrifice to this
Ye-
operation. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was kind of a, well, I would say an uninspired choice, which even Lucas did admit, because he does not have that. He was a very conservative general in the terms of his attacking propensity. He would be very reluctant to attack, and unfortunately, he was commanded to take the landings, and he was scared that, hey, my men are gonna die, we'll be exposed, I need supplies, whatever. But there were cracks in this entire operation right from the planning stages,
Big
because
times.
um, both these generals that felt like you needed an entire army for this operation, right? Like when they estimated the manpower requirements, they
Oh
were
yeah.
like, yeah, we need like a minimum 2 corps of soldiers, and I think the Supreme Allied Command just allocated 1 corps at the most initially, and they were not happy with this whatsoever. But you know, you gotta deal with it now. And even though Churchill, as you said, he wanted this and he secured the LSTs. They just had enough LSTs to land 2 divisions worth. So that's not really, I think that's about half of the planned invasion force at the start could be delivered instantly. And, you know, I think the biggest problem was, which was kind of surprising at this stage for the Allies, was the intelligence picture failed miserably.
Oh boy, yes. There's multiple errors in this one.
I mean, it was, and I should also add, while the landings at Anzio, which is like, what we're talking about, took place, there was also supposed to be a diversionary attack at Montexino,
Yes.
authorized by Clark. And the hope was at least, one of them should draw away a good chunk of the German reinforcements. And, hey, then the other prong can break out. But unfortunately, they kind of estimated the Allied intelligence. They gave Lucas that, hey, there's just going to be 1 division or something in the immediate vicinity. You have nothing to worry about. But they, I think, forgot to mention that the reality was actually closer to 6 divisions.
Yep.
So,
Not to
you know,
mention the terrain in question. To give the audience an idea, this was
y-
reclaimed marshland. So this is like
yeah.
marshland that they had used like dams and other things to kind of get some of the water out of. So
Hmm.
it was already bad terrain, but when the Axis finds out that there's been a landing there, they're basically holding these valves and they just turn those valves off so that the water comes back in and just basically makes this a flooded kind of nightmare. And the bridgehead, well, the beachhead that's formed by the Allies here is so small, and it has so
Yeah.
many units constricted into a very, very confined area. And they're more or less they're in a marsh, and surrounding
Yeah.
the marsh is going to be hills where
Yeah.
Axis artillery is going to be placed. So it's like the
It,
worst
and
situation.
Yeah, and even though he had a very good initial landing with, very little combat and
Complete
everything, and
surprise, yeah.
yeah, complete surprise. But the problem was Lucas's personality really played into this. He then did not advance at all. He started to build up his forces, get supplies, get defenses up, which,
Well,
I can understand why he might want to do it. But the problem was Kesselring was quite a decisive commander. He immediately
yes.
ordered like at least 3 divisions to quickly take the hills surrounding the beachhead. And and as you said, as we know, natural terrain plays a lot into defense. And
So
now suddenly they could not really get out of the beach without heavy resistance, because the Germans had already entrenched themselves there.
So one thing we have to explain to the audience is this is a legendary he said she said kind of situation, whereas
Mhm.
Clark himself is responsible for a lot of the issues that are going to happen.
Yeah,
And basically, what ended up happening is Clark had an idea, and I think everybody had a general idea that this was a very dangerous operation. This is kind of a
yeah,
gamble. And not that it was your only option, but more or less, the idea was you're going to land and then you have to advance to Rome and hope that the Gustav line breaks and breaches, and then you'll be saved because
yeah,
otherwise you're done. And the idea of forming a beachhead and then basically treating it like Guadalcanal and just holding on for dear life was the opposite of what was supposed to be done.
Uh, yeah, if I remember correctly, he held that beachhead for 3 days before even starting to send scouting parties out. By
Yeah, and
which time
they went to
Kesselring,
Rome. Yeah, the
yeah,
scouting parties. Yeah,
but the problem was by that time Kesselring had already got 3 divisions worth of units in defensive positions around, and that
yeah.
ensured that an easy breakout would not happen.
And
But
he had adequate time to make an attack. He could have advanced upon Rome because if there was an element of surprise, Kesselring didn't have any idea for a little bit, and
yeah,
unfortunately, they gave Kesselring enough time to perform his counter attack. But I'll just gotta bring this up because I wanted to do a bit of research. Clark withheld a lot of information from Lucas is the only way to put it.
yeah,
And what else is interesting is Clark's direct orders are very misleading. They're kind of a little bit ambiguous. So Clark, where is it? These are the direct orders that Lucas had received. Seize and
hmm
secure a beachhead in the vicinity of Anzio. Number 2, advance to secure Colle d'Azali in the Alban Hills. Number 3, prepare to advance on Rome. And then his final order was to advance on Colle d'Azali. But when when you're looking at that, it seems that it's almost like he has a choice of when he's going to advance on Rome or something. Like he has to make and determine when that's a viable thing. But in reality, he should have been doing this immediately. Like it doesn't make any sense.
and actually I think this was like Mark Clark wanted like a bit of that glory of taking it to Rome, because that's what he
Yes,
did. Because
that's exactly it.
and
Yeah,
one thing that I should point out is Harold Alexander, who was the Allied commander in the area, so Clark had to report to him. He was not happy with that,
yeah,
because Eisenhower, his good friend, had been withdrawn for Overlord.
yeah.
And the problem was Overlord at that time in early 1944 was such a tightly guarded secret amongst the Allied high command that Clark also had no idea about it. The only person in the entire theater who knew about it, Harold Alexander. That's it.
Of course.
But the thing is, as we were saying, the intelligence picture fails so badly. Like, I think there was this one attack, right? And Lucas tried to break out because they landed reinforcements, and anyways, Lucas was subsequently sacked. But there were 7 Allied divisions to 5 German divisions, and more were being mobilized. I think the US 500 and fourth, like there was also rotating, but sorry, one moment. There was this one Ranger unit, like
Psst. Hey you ever hear me talk about some great Pacific War movie or documentary like Pearl Harbor Minute by Minute over on Netflix and feel the urge to watch it for yourself? Uh-oh, you live in Japan and your Netflix doesn't have it? Must suck to be you.
Sucks to be me right now.
Oh wow, season 4 of Demon Slayer is out. Oh wait, I can't watch it on Canadian Netflix, but it's over on Japan Netflix? Whatever will I do?
Oh, no, no.
Being blocked from regional content? With private internet access, you too can watch Demon Slayer Season 4 by switching your IP address to Japan.
Yes! Hell yeah!
Why stop with Japan? With private internet access, you can change your IP address to over 84 different countries and every single US state, giving you access to region-restricted content all over the world.
Nice.
Many websites and services like Netflix are only accessible depending on your physical location, but private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions. Think about it. Without private internet access, it's like paying for a TV series and missing out on the latest season. Shots fired, Demon Slayer on Canadian Netflix.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Ever fear people are gonna find your Google searches?
Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
FBI, open up!
Private internet access makes sure that those Google searches remain a buried secret, as private internet access encrypts your internet access and has a no logs policy. Think you're safe with the local coffee shop's free Wi-Fi? No, you are certainly not. Private internet access gives you more privacy features than any other software and real-time protection from malware and trackers, giving you peace of mind knowing those Google searches remain seen by you and you alone. Private internet access has a no-log policy that they've defended in court, which means they are not storing any of your browsing data. Hey, are you like me using different devices under one household? Private internet access is available on all platforms and protects an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. I personally use private internet access to unblock movies and TV series from all across the globe, and I sleep easier writing scripts for my YouTube channel and others knowing my data is secure. Look, this is a no-brainer. Sign up with my link in the description of this video to get 83% off, plus 4 months for free, so it ends up being only around $2 per month. Signing up for private internet access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is available. So don't forget to click www.piavpn.com/the Pacific War channel, and a big thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video.
I think the first and third Ranger battalions were actually sent on a faulty mission. They thought they were supposed to secure an area that was
Yeah.
to be guarded by a couple of companies of Germans, but turns out, hey, this is the assembly point for a couple of German divisions who are already they are reaching, and that attack was brutal. Like, I think 6 men of an almost 800-man force was all that returned to the Allied lines.
And this is actually, I'm a Canadian, of course, so I had to make a special mention to this. It's here during this operation, the 1st Special Service Forces over there, aka the Black
Yeah.
Devils. So this is a special forces unit. It was American and Canadian. It was a joint command. And if I'm correct, it was here where the Germans actually started to, call them the Devils. Well, the Devils Brigade, I guess they would have called them. And then, they were referred to as the Black Devils because they would smear, black, what was it, the polish you put on the boots on their faces for their covert operations in the dark at night and stuff.
Yeah.
So they actually had to do a lot of interesting stuff during this operation because they were supposed to be protecting basically one of the flanks, and it was a hell of a fight for them.
Yeah, but like the allies for so I think we should also point out the landings took place towards the end of January, and basically they are just sitting there just trying. It's like a slugfest between the two sides for 5 months, and it's only towards the end of May do the allies start to break out, and by then, because
Ironically, I was going to say, ironically, they kind of ended up doing the objective of breaking the Gustav line, but it wasn't the way it was supposed to be.
True enough, and I think that's where Clark gets his glory about going to Rome and having the press conference on 5th of June, thinking he's on top of the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
And he did not even let any British soldiers who were also fighting in that
He
beachhead
banned them.
come
Yeah,
in.
I know. He positioned all of his MPs and everything to make sure that they wouldn't. Yeah, he really made sure to steal the glory in Rome.
Yeah, but I think the best thing was, this is why it's an underrated moment, is 6th of June 1944 was the next day. That's all I'm saying.
Of course.
And suddenly everyone was like, yeah, this is not important. Let's move on to D-Day.
I said this in a podcast I did a few weeks ago with my audience, because it was, of course, the anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy. And something that no one ever talks about is the United States was nearly simultaneously performing Operation Forager, which was the largest amphibious landings over in the Pacific. And I say simultaneous. Basically the men were on the ships going over to the locations, Saipan and stuff.
Yeah.
And if you look at it, the United States was simultaneously putting out 200,000 people in 2 different locations on 2 different sides of the world, using an incredible amount of shipping resources and everything.
Oh yeah, that's just crazy industrial power.
But because D-Day just captures the heart and minds of everybody, no one would know about Forager, and it happens literally so the 6th, it happens a week after almost. Well, the first landings, because there's 3 major landings. And yeah, everything gets overshadowed by those big moments,
Yeah, and unfortunately, Anzio, despite Clark getting to Rome and the withdrawal, it was still a very costly offensive for the Allies.
Oh yeah.
That, some people were saying, yeah, you might as well have just started to batter down the Gustav line instead of doing this.
They might as well, because the terrain that this beachhead was formed in was going to, because they were getting hit by artillery every day. The amount of casualties was
Yeah,
incredible. It was it was not a tenable position. If anything, they
yeah.
probably should have pulled out. Like I'm surprised that they continued.
Yeah, and the thing is, because of Clark's diversionary attacks to help this beachhead, the armies that were facing the Gustav line suffered like, 45,000 casualties, especially like during Operation Diadem alone. So, it's a drain of immense amount of manpower.
And I'll just
And,
tell the audience, Operation Diadem is a result of Operation Shingle. This is, I guess you could call it, it's almost
it,
not, it's not, not,
it was
not,
a,
not it's a rescue operation, but it's to break out of this beachhead.
yeah, I guess I was calling it a diversion because it was to help them, break out of this place. So, they needed to do something. And, so there was a lot of criticism of naturally towards this operation. Even Churchill was not exempt from it. And again,
Yeah.
when Churchill coined up an operation, it's always controversial, Gallipoli, and now he's done it for World War II.
Gallipoli is, and
And
I don't think a lot of people are aware of what a colossal mistake, and it cost Churchill his career. I mean,
it,
Churchill
it, it
comes
did.
back, but it absolutely ended him. And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but
Yeah.
ironically, if you look at what the plan was for Gallipoli, Churchill wasn't necessarily in the wrong. It was the admirals on these ships, the captains of these old battleships. They weren't willing to sacrifice them, and the whole purpose was to get rid of them. These were obsolete, terrible ships. And Churchill, I mean, when he found out that they just stalemated everything, he was like, "What is going on? This is completely against what the
Yeah.
operation was supposed to be. It was supposed to
I
just
mean, it
throw this
was,
club at them."
yeah, I mean, like, just a quick note on Gallipoli because I won't take time. It was like, and they also badly underestimated how much
Oh yeah.
with the tenacity with which the Turks would fight. So I think that was also badly underestimated, and that caused the bloodbath that was there. But so like Churchill blamed a lot of the failures of Shingle on General Lucas,
Yeah. He has a
which
famous
I
quote.
guess,
Yeah.
yeah, and the thing is, Harold Alexander and Kesselring, they kind of wrote about this
Mhm.
operation, right? So Harold Alexander said, ultimately everything panned out the way it did. I think that was for the best. And Kesselring also said, breaking out at that time, there would not have been any significant strategic objectives or gain. So it wasn't necessarily a right decision. But yeah, uh,
And
it it really was like, one of the most, I will call it, it's quite an underrated operation.
yes, and until you had actually brought it up in this conversation, it was one of those where I look at the list of objectives and things done during the Italian campaign, and it doesn't even meet my attention, because I'm more focused on other things. So
Yeah.
it definitely is underrated. And it's interesting because you're the one who picked these subjects that you decided to pick the next subject. I don't want to simplify it as Operation Dragoon, but it's how I know it
Yeah.
as. But the southern landings in France
Mhm.
are implicated because of this operation too. Because Shingle takes away some resources that leads to even further delays and then messes up what was supposed to originally be the southern landings, which would have been simultaneous with the D-Day landings in Normandy once upon a
I
time.
think one thing I should add for, like, the southern France landings, the British were completely against the plan from
Of
the get-go.
course, Churchill
Yeah,
wanted to go in the
Churchill,
Balkans.
Italy. He was obsessed with that, and he did not really want to throw in support. But I think what really put in the support for this operation was, this landings, they take place on 15th August, right? So it's been 2.5 months pretty much since D-Day. And as you know, right, like, even though D-Day, you had all that material planning, advantages of manpower, air power, intelligence, the Allied breakout isn't happening. So
No.
the the idea was, they wanted to land down here, make use of the facilities of the port after they captured him, right? You have the ports of Toulon and everything, and then try to drive a wedge and destroy the German army down there. Even though it was officially called Army Group G, it wasn't really an army group; it was just an army.
Well, they kept taking away units from them and then replacing them with Ostlegonen and the Osthupen and all that. Like, not the best troops and stuff. And yeah.
Yeah. But, it's still quite a large undertaking that was,
Here, just to
put
explain to the
together.
audience, there's actually two different operations that it's called before. Like I think this one was Operation Anvil, or Overlord was Anvil at one point, but there was going to be simultaneous landings in Normandy and southern France initially. But then it was deemed unfeasible because they just, there was no way, they didn't have the resources necessary. So they canceled this operation, I think twice. But because of the D-Day landings, there's so much materials brought over the English Channel that they're seeing congestion. And I mean, they literally built a super city in the beachhead. Like it was incredible. They had everything you could imagine, but there was too much congestion, and they literally needed somewhere else to put stuff. On top of that, Charles de Gaulle, who personally I hate this guy, he wanted to get the Free French more into the fight. And if they did do an action in southern France, this would have like opened up a rationale to have more French in the fight. And obviously he also wants to liberate places in France. It makes sense. But for Churchill, as always, who spent World War II thinking about only how to retain the empire, he wanted to focus on Italy or even go into the Balkans, because basically he saw that Stalin's offensives were kicking up and he was getting really close, and he didn't want to hand over the Balkans to Stalin in the post-war agreement. So he wanted to basically land in places just to halt the Soviets. And of course he had other interests in the Balkans. There's tons of resources and stuff that you can acquire there. And as we see after World War II, the British were very heavily invested. Yeah, they were heavily invested.
Consequences into the Cold War from this operation. But
Greece almost went communist. A lot of stuff happened. But Churchill was kind of the one who fought the most to not land in southern France until they just forced the issue. Because I have to hand it to Churchill. I have no idea why FDR gave in to him all the time. It's insane. Like Churchill would talk his way into getting anything he ever needed. He was really good at that. But
I mean, he really had a way with FDR,
Yeah, they had a very
especially
personal relationship.
I mean, true. I think they used to sign to each other in the letters as former Navy person or something, because both had an interest in the Navy.
Yeah.
But it was southern France, they take place there were those reasons, right, as to ease the congestion in Normandy, try to get the French more involved.
There's a lot of ration, because it helps in so many ways, because the units like Army G, as you say, they're pitching a lot of their units north to help try and attack in Normandy to get rid of this beachhead and stuff. And it's hindering them, to open up another front would just make sense, so they can finally break through and go liberate the rest of France and such. So it was a no-brainer from that point of view. And they had all the ships to do it at that point, because they had already done D-Day. So you're sitting on the greatest armada on earth. You might as well use it to land somewhere else.
Yeah, and actually, as you said, you had battle experienced and equipped troops, whereas Army Group G had been so thoroughly stripped, even though it numbered around 8 or 9 divisions at the time of the invasion. They were basically second or third rate units, and this is how thinly stretched it was. Each division was responsible for around 90 kilometers of the line. I mean,
that's
incredible.
Just
and and so I think for your Pacific War listeners, a familiar general takes command of this operation from the American forces,
Alexander
Patch.
Yeah,
and it does follow a similar operation to D-Day, right? You have the Free French resistance sabotaging. And also, unfortunately, the French suffer brutal reprisals from the Germans.
Terrible massacres upon civilians for working with the Allies. And ironically, it only pushed the French civilians to sabotage and do more. It really, I mean, I understand why, of course, but
it was that. And then you had some commando raids before to destroy some key installations, paratroop drops, which also were misdropped, but not as bad as the scale that we had seen at D-Day.
I did want to mention, so there is a preliminary operation before the actual landings, or even the paratroops. So again, the first Special Service Force, this Canadian-American Special Unit, they were going to take down the Hay Islands. So these are islands, it's Poitras and Levant, that are kind of protecting. Basically, from this position, they could hit
Yeah.
where they're going to land. So these guys end up landing. They don't end up facing much as they're doing sabotage work in that. But again, it's another mention of the Black Devils. And I mean, I'm just, as a Canadian, whenever we get to talk about Canadians, World War II, we try.
Fair enough. Yeah. So you had that, and then you had like, the First Airborne Task Force, dropping in, doing the similar stuff as what the 101st Airborne and the other paratroopers did at
Very
D-Day.
similar to Normandy. Yeah, we had
Yeah.
we had the parachutes and the gliders coming in first to take strategic areas to protect the landing sites so that the Germans can't just swiftly come in and hit them at the beaches, as they say.
Yeah, and actually this time it was far better planned and executed. Even though there were misdrops, some guys landed 15, 20 miles away from their intended landing zone.
Of course. Yeah.
Well, overall, it was a force of 9,000 airborne troops for this, and around 104 only were, killed in the landings, which is much lesser than what we saw in D-Day.
Well, that was, I mean, what they used to call it, Rommel asparagus, I believe. It was his idea to put these huge stakes in the ground that would catch the gliders and stuff. Because during the D-Day parachute landings, this was at night, so you couldn't really see the ground. So a lot of people were mangled and killed by those things. And anti-aircraft fire, of course.
Yeah, so, that was done. And, but as we said, this was quite an underprepared army. So while they fought tenaciously, the initial landings were just like, it was kind of more for walkover.
Yeah.
So, they did try to counterattack, but, then they quickly realized within like 2 days that, okay, the landing's lost. We cannot even bother to do it, because compared to D-Day, on 48 hours into D-Day, there was still a slim but fairly reasonable prospect of pushing back the beaches.
Definitely. Well, I mean, Rommel's idea, I mean, because Rommel butted heads with his other subordinate commanders because they wanted to not have the armored mobile units so close to the coast, whereas Rommel had wanted that. I think either side had problems because if the Allies had aerial supremacy, they were going to bomb whatever armored convoys you're going to throw at them. So it didn't matter in the end. But yeah, in Normandy, they had a chance. Definitely. If somehow Rommel could have used his mobile units effectively and hit the hardest pressed sectors, they could have done a lot of damage on D-Day. Southern France, there is no chance. They weren't holding it.
Yeah, and actually just speaking to like the D-Day solution that ultimately the Germans came up was even worse. Because like, as we said, Rommel wanted to keep all the armor near the coast.
Yeah.
The commander, Rundstedt, wanted to keep a central reserve all together and just send a massed attack.
They made the worst decision, allow both to have a 50. It's the worst you can do.
Oh, and not to mention 4 panzer divisions were not even under Rundstedt's command. It was only Hitler who would be allowed to authorize the movement.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to see the miscommunications there. I mean, it's typical Axis, just typical German. Like, it's incredible. As anytime Hitler got involved in anything in World War II, when it came to military operations, he caused problems. If he let his generals just do things, he probably it would have been a better outcome for them. They were going to lose, but
Yeah, but I think this should be stated on how quick the Allies advanced in southern France.
Yes.
Right, like for example, Caen was supposed to be like what, D-Day +2 capture at best, and Boulogne and everything. But everything was captured quite late. The port of Toulon and Marseille were captured 5 days successfully after the landings.
Yeah.
I mean, they are quite big. They're big ports.
And they had a huge advantage where the French resistance was a lot more capable in southern France because they had a lot more to work with and not as many Axis members down their throats. Although obviously reprisals happened, but
no, there were reprisals. But as you said, that's probably because this was technically Vichy France and not the occupied territory. So
yeah,
the Axis did kind of let the Vichy have some amount of control within their area. So, I'm not too surprised that the French resistance was more effective as compared to, say, the occupied zone where there's a much heavier German presence.
Yeah, definitely.
But, this is quite, when we get to the outcome, right? On this tactical level, I think it was a very successful and necessary operation. You got like several ports on southern France full, and unlike Boulogne and all the ports of Normandy, which were completely trashed and took months to repair, they were pretty much captured intact, which really helped. And I think, well, mostly intact. By September they were repaired, and this is like, I think, a good case of why it was needed.
Yeah.
October 1944, southern France got around 525,000 tons of supplies of all types. Okay, and this was about 35% of all the Western Front forces requirements.
It's colossal in scope.
Oh yeah,
It's
it
absolutely
is. I
colossal.
mean, I'm just thinking now about North Africa, where the Panzer Army needed a total of 70,000 a month,
70,000, yeah.
and you're already 7.5 times more, and that's just like one third.
Yeah. And it really does go to show those who don't even look at the logistics of World War II, or for example, if you break it down to just oil, fuel,
Yeah,
if you were to pick, am I going to be on the side of the Axis or am I going to be side of the Allies? The Axis came into World War II with the lowest amount of fuel or anything necessary for modern militaries,
yeah.
and in a war, in a total war, it just there was no getting around it. The Axis had to
Uh,
knock out their opponents immediately or it was over.
yeah, yeah. I think that is like, that's a standard German tactic dating back to the Kingdom of Prussia.
Yes.
You have to win quickly or you lose the war.
I
And
mean,
we saw
it's
that
always,
happen.
it is fascinating. You go all the way back then, go to World War One with the Schlieffen Plan, and World War Two. It's kind of Schlieffen, a little bit esque
It's
also.
it's I mean, see, the principle is the same, but it's the only thing that changed was obviously the way with which they attained it.
Yes,
But in principle, it was the same. But as you said, but speaking of logistics, the downside of the Allies' heavy momentum, right, or the heavy mechanization, it meant that the momentum stopped after a while, which is why you had the opportunity for the Battle of the Bulge. And that is the same problem that
yes.
happened in southern France even though in 4 weeks they pretty much liberated like more than a third of the country, which was far faster than what we saw with the Normandy breakouts. But again,
Definitely.
fuel slowed the advance down because, the British and Americans, they believed in using a lot of tanks and artillery and tractors and everything, which, unfortunately, while you may not have as big of a ratio of manpower, you do have a bigger ratio of vehicles, and that means you need more fuel.
Well, this might help audience members understand this. Compare Rommel in North Africa to the Japanese in general in the Pacific versus the Allies. When the Allies perform an operation, they will not allow the operation to be carried out unless the adequate amount of, let's say, if it's amphibious in nature, they have to have the adequate amount of shipping. The men need to be brought with every single amount of supplies. We talk the provisions, the fuel, everything, the
Yeah,
trucks. There's no, as we say in English, there's no half-assing it.
yeah.
Rommel in North Africa, not that he was explicitly told to do this, but he depended on just stealing from the Allied supply depots across the desert, much like the
Yeah, I think
Japanese.
yeah, and a lot of his advances, especially in 1941 and 42, was only because he was successfully able to annihilate the British before they retreated or destroyed their supplies. And
Yes.
I think his command car was actually a British car for
Yes.
quite a
He
while in
took a
North
British
Africa.
armor. Yeah, yeah. And if you look at Tobruk, when the Axis took Tobruk, it's like they were depending on taking it to take those supplies to carry on. So
Yeah,
during, like, for example, the first Battle of El Alamein, they had kind of received a bit of a boost. They had taken a lot of the British goods, or as I think, what did they call them? Churchill's gifts or something like that. They had a fancy name for it. And they were depending on it. And it's a very good comparison to the Japanese, because the Japanese actual messaging and the doctrine was, let's take Guadalcanal or uh, any of the islands in general.
yeah,
When these army guys are thrown into the islands, they're not given the adequate amount of
eh,
supplies that they need to perform military operations. And they're told, you're going to be foraging, like actual foraging for sweet potatoes or whatever, like in Okinawa, and
yeah,
you're going to be stealing from the enemy. So they emphasize night
or
raids.
taking it from the locals.
Taking,
which-
well, yeah, and brutalizing the locals helps win you the war. When the locals start helping the allies,
Yep.
every
Yeah.
island. I mean, even in places that were dominated by the Japanese, like take a place like Saipan. Actually, that's a bad example because the civilians had tremendously died as a result of that and threw their lives away. But there's
Yeah.
places where you'd had the Japanese were there for a while, but the locals end up helping the allies anyways. And even
Yeah.
the Korean laborers, the Formosan laborers, sometimes they would just help
They-
the
they-
allies.
They were more friendly towards the allies, right? I remember in Guadalcanal, like, they were the first ones giving the intelligence to the
Yeah.
Marine Division.
And they volunteered to bury the Japanese. They love doing that. Yeah. That was something that Marines like took a notice of. It's that the Koreans loved burying the Japanese.
Well, if it helps, it helps, I guess.
Yeah. But
But
this has been a great podcast, but I think I've
Yeah.
definitely learned something from this podcast. And like I had told you before we even started recording this, I've done this so
Yeah.
many times with other guys. Every time we pick like multiple subjects, it's not enough time to really tackle this.
yeah,
So I just
I
want
don't
to,
think we've done that like the due justice, but I'm
yeah.
just glad we were at least able to get some attention out for these topics.
Exactly. For the future audience here, we were discussing, me and Gaurav, and we're going to try and really hammer like mini series on a subject, for example, or doing like a specific episode on a single subject. And for example, if it's a particular battle, let's say the fall of Singapore or something, we'll nail it in in an episode and we'll talk about it specifically. Because I understand when
Yeah.
I look at my downloads, when it's on a single subject, the downloads skyrocket. When it's on more of these ambiguous multiple subjects, like it's a hit or a miss. I understand people, and especially if we title this episode "Logistics of World War II,"
Yeah,
I don't think I'll get many downloads because people don't tend to love that.
yeah, I know. It's like I said, it's still sad logistics never get its due for wars.
No, and especially
Because-
since I'm the Pacific War channel, and this is
Right.
when the United States to this day has not performed the logistical challenge that it faced then. No country on earth today, let's say there actually was a hot war between China and the United States. The United States is the only country that's actually done the physical work to transport units and materials across the Pacific Ocean, to take multiple beachheads and build airfields and enemy locations and do all this work. It's never been
I
done
mean,
since.
like I think the one thing I'll just say about the Pacific War logistics, at least like in Europe, you're still targeting ports.
Yeah.
North Africa, you still had the ports, right? It makes your job so much more easier. Like on Saipan, Guam, or some XYZ atoll. Like
There's a dirt
port-
field over there. Let's make it an
Yeah.
airfield. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Or in Guadalcanal, it's like, oh, we're stuck on this island. What can we use to make an airfield? Oh, the Japanese left this like one construction piece of equipment. It's pretty old and crappy. Let's just use it and see what we can do. And you
Yeah,
can see
I mean-
footage of planes landing on these dirt dirt airfields. Like, yeah.
But yeah, I think, it's still like, I'm really enjoying this podcast. So thanks for having me on here.
Oh, and I just let everybody know they're going to be hearing a lot more from you. So stay
Yep.
tuned. And well, here's a little teaser for the audience. I had already mentioned I'm currently working on the entire North African campaign series for Kings and Generals, but it's a YouTube series. It's not a podcast. But since I'm sitting on probably more than 100 pages at this point of notes on the North African campaign, why not tackle it as a mini series? So we're going to do that on the Pacific War channel. Yeah, a little different, but we'll see if the audience likes it. I would love to tackle more things outside of the Pacific War. So stay tuned, everybody, and thank you for coming onto this show, Gaurav.
Thanks, Greg, and looking forward to our next work.